Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane. It's the morning of Friday, the 7th of December, 2018. I'm in the rather unusual setting of my vehicle, primarily because it is absolutely chucking it down outside. And although it's not particularly cold, temperatures of an unseasonal 12 degrees, but nonetheless, the wind is gusting, so this is a better environment this morning. Hopefully I'll be back outside where I prefer to be early next week. Well, the title of this morning's broadcast is Awakening to the Corporatist Agenda. And whilst there's a lot of column inches being dedicated to what's occurring in France right now, I haven't really seen any genuine analysis of what's occurring. Every commentator seems to be using the French situation, the uprising in France, because that's what it is, to further their own agenda. So I've been somewhat remiss perhaps in not reporting on what's going on in France, but I've been waiting for some of my contacts in France to get back to me with their version of events. Now, I lived in France twice in the 1990s for about 12 months for the whole of 1990, and then for part of 94 and 95. And I enjoyed the hell out of France. It's a wonderful culture. But, of course, it is being undermined, just like every other culture on the planet, to further the globalist agenda and to destroy nation states. But more of that a little later. First, I just want to give you an update on the David Noakes situation. And for those, of course, who are not familiar, David Noakes was jailed last week for the heinous crime of having the health and well-being of cancer sufferers in particular at heart. But of course the corporatist agenda is not to permit anything to come to market that undermines the revenue streams of big pharma. So he and others were charged with the manufacture and distribution of an unlicensed medicine. And I cannot reiterate enough the judge and his very balanced approach, Justice Nicholas Lorraine Smith, making the observation many, many times through the Newton hearing that the veracity or the efficacy of GC-MAF was not on trial. And in his preamble prior to actually sentencing David and his former wife Lorraine, he stated that he had no doubt that many people had benefited from GC-MAF and many people would benefit in the future, although not if the MHRA have their way. And the last broadcast I made was a week ago, and at the time I hadn't seen the video that the MHRA had posted on their website. And I am going to draw people's attention to it because it is crass. It is two sociopaths, Tariq Sawar and Anthony Archibald, literally bragging that they have managed to succeed in getting David Noakes and his associates sentenced, David in particular, of course, to 15 months in jail. And of course, not a single mention of the fact that the medicine, GC-MAF, this product, had such a phenomenal success rate in treating up to and including stage 4 cancers, ME, autism even, based on the research of Dr. Jeffrey Bradstreet, who was found with bullet wounds in his chest, face down in a river in the Carolinas the day after his clinic was raided in the USA by the Food and Drug Administration at the behest of the MHRA. So the MHRA is effectively a criminal organization masquerading as a government department. Its sole purpose is to protect the revenue streams of Big Pharma. And of course, Big Pharma wants to keep people sick. It wants people effectively on their payroll. And it will do whatever it takes to get people on the payroll by effectively getting them hooked on prescription drugs, and basically keep them alive as long as possible, regardless of the quality of life that they do or don't enjoy. All Big Pharma wants is the revenue stream. And of course, a massive chunk of that comes from chemo and radiotherapy. So, when the prosecution tried to allude that David Noakes, by producing GC-MAF, was preying on the vulnerable, well, let's actually reflect upon that. It's Big Pharma and its front of house sales force, otherwise known as GPs, who are effectively preying on desperate people, because people who effectively know they're going to die as a result of an illness will do whatever it takes in many cases. And that includes taking or subjecting themselves to chemo or radiotherapy without realizing perhaps that the efficacy of chemo and radiotherapy is just 2.3%. In other words, they got a 97.7% of actually dying, and that death being potentially delayed by chemo or radiotherapy, but look what it does to their quality of life. So please, I will put a link to this video. Surprise, surprise, comments have been disabled, and I cannot actually think of a more outrageous product from a government department, but what it does is it illustrates the total disregard for human health and well-being. And it's interesting, of course, that the video is made by two of the MHRA henchmen, Tarek Sarwar and Anthony Archibald. Archibald, of course, being the former Surrey police officer and detective chief inspector, who obviously saw richer pickings by working with the MHRA. Well, there's some other, good news that's come about. Wales, it seems, has taken the decision to do everything it possibly can to make sure that not just fracking, but hydrocarbon exploitation is right at the bottom end of its list of priorities for energy. So this is a very astute way for the Welsh Assembly to effectively ban fracking in the Principality. So well done to the people of Wales. So that means that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland now have effective bans on the process of abstraction of unconventional hydrocarbons, which only leaves England. And, of course, Theresa May and Greg Clark and Claire Perry are really hoping that everyone is distracted by the Brexit or non-Brexit drama to focus too much on what's going on within the fracking industry. But, it's not going away, and neither is the opposition. And next week, for 3 days, on Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, I shall be at the Royal Courts at Fetter Lane in London. Nearest tube station is Chancery Lane. And I shall be challenging the IGAS injunction, which was granted at an ex-parte hearing, nobody else present, at the back end of, I believe, gosh, it seems so long ago, back end of August. And then in September, we had the interim hearing, which I challenged as litigant in person. But literally, breaking news in the last few days, I have instructed a barrister, Paul Powlesland of Ely Place Chambers, and he will be representing me at this hearing. And let me tell you, I think this is going to be an absolutely seminal hearing. And, what it's going to demonstrate, if nothing else, is the degree to which the corporations have got the judiciary in their pockets. This is not about upholding parliamentary law, and I'll requote Justice Nicholas Lorraine Smith during David Noakes' trial, he made the observation that as a member of the judiciary, Parliament sets the laws and his job is to uphold that law. Well, in the case of the injunctions, it's not the case. Parliament has not set this legislation. It's the courts effectively establishing a raft of supra-parliamentary legislation to give the corporations free rein to literally rape and pillage the environment and indeed the human resources, all in the pursuance of profit. And of course, that profit goes to a very small number of people. And this really does bring us on to what's occurring in France. And the most common media coverage that I've seen suggests that this is all about a fuel tax. Well, that may be one small part of it. But what's really occurring in France, and this is from multiple inputs from around the country, and basically they are all saying the same thing. And this is the realization that Macron in particular is effectively the Tony Blair of France. In other words, he is in situ to accelerate the corporatist agenda. And one of the objectives of introducing a smoking ban was to restrict the opportunities for people to come together to put the world to rights. And that's why we're seeing so many pubs closing, because people, when they go out for a drink, they also want to go out for a smoke in many cases. And so not being able to smoke or being banned to the outside of the pub, particularly in the winter months, isn't particularly attractive. So guess what? People stop going to pubs, and therefore people stop coming together and putting the world to rights, or coming to agree plans of action to do something about that which they feel needs attention. In France, the Macron government is actually doing its level best to try to create barriers to the traditional farmers' markets, which are almost daily occurrences in the centres of most cities and towns and villages throughout France. And of course, the farmers' markets are a beautiful opportunity for not just the farmers, but for the local townsfolk to come together and then either chat in the market or chat in the cafes surrounding the market. And what's occurring right now in France is a spontaneous uprising against the global corporatist agenda. If you look at some of the banners that are being paraded in these marches, it's addressing the issue of establishment paedophilia. It's addressing the issue of forced vaccination. It's addressing the issue of the undermining of the quality of natural foods and also natural medicines. And the bottom line is that the traditional French population has also reached the limit of its tolerance when it comes to unfettered immigration. Now, France has always embraced immigrants, particularly, from its former North African colonies. But the situation in France, like many other European countries, has got out of hand over the last few years. And this, of course, is the Coudenhove-Kalergi agenda. And this dates back from the 1920s and Count Coudenhove-Kalergi's discourse on Pan-Europa, in which he talks about the need to break the natural homogeneity of the European nations. And one of the fastest ways to do that is have mass immigration to break up and ultimately destroy the national culture. And the purpose of doing this, and Coudenhove-Kalergi is quite blatant about it in Pan-Europa, is that once you actually break down the allegiance of the national population, and it doesn't have a natural allegiance to a particular country, then the government of that country can basically do what the hell it likes because it has no opposition. And he says that this enables the aristocracy and the spiritual elite, and for the moment I'll leave you to determine who he was referring to by the spiritual elite. He says that they will have then free reign to do whatever they want over the resources, the natural, the environmental, and the human resources of those countries. So this has been accelerated by the awareness of the forthcoming Morocco treaty, which is going to be signed next week. This is a UN meeting, and it's the Morocco Immigration Accord. And this is the Intergovernmental Conference to adopt the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. And this is effectively the Coudenhove-Kalergi agenda on steroids. And, basically, of course, the draft outcome document has already been produced. And this is simply the charade to bring the 160-odd nations of the United Nations together to sign this accord. Now, interestingly, the US has pulled out of this with the observation that this accord is not conducive with US sovereignty. Well, in reality, of course, this accord is not conducive with any nation state's sovereignty, and that is precisely the objective. Of course, this goal was championed by the likes of Peter Sutherland, who is an Irishman by accident at birth, but actually spent his last 30 years on this mortal coil pushing the globalist agenda, primarily through immigration. And, Sutherland said that, he basically was doing everything he possibly could to bring about the destruction of the nation state, and started with his home country of Ireland. Now, the impact of this is very significant for the corporations, because what it does is it creates the opportunity to establish an excess of labor, and primarily cheap labor, because invariably the quality and the standard of life of the migrants from the countries that they are leaving is perhaps less than the countries that they are intending to reach. And who can blame them for wanting to better their lifestyle for themselves and their families? So they go on these long marches, and in fact the British Council have offices in sub-Saharan Africa, literally recruiting people to migrate to England, simply stating that if they can make their way to England, there's a house and there's a job waiting for them. Obviously that is the Dick Whittington philosophy. The streets of London are paved with gold, but maybe when you get there, the reality is a little bit different. But what it does is it creates the opportunity to employ increasing numbers of people on minimum wage, and increasing numbers of people on 0 hours contracts. Now, ultimately, of course, this is very destructive. It's self-destructive to some extent, because the bottom line is if people do not have disposable income, then there is no economy, because people don't have the financial resources to purchase the products produced by the corporatocracy, unless, of course, they borrow. Oh, and of course, that's also part of the agenda, to literally have everybody in debt slavery. Well, the French, because they still have their farmers markets, because they still have their places where they can meet as a community, and they can discuss the issues that are increasingly becoming anathema or even outlawed. And in fact, by the way, part of this accord that's being signed in Morocco, it will effectively make criticism of the migration agenda hate speech. So once again, we see the agenda being weaponized so that basically anybody who dares to criticize it runs the risk of effectively being dragged through the courts and accused of hate speech. And we are seeing an increasing amount of weaponized vocabulary. And, this should be a cause for concern. But of course, what's occurring is there are so many issues right now. Whether it's the suppression of effective cancer cures, whether it's the unconventional hydrocarbons agenda, whether it's Brexit or lack of. Not everybody can get involved in everything, but it's really, really important that people get involved in something. And who knows, eventually the British might actually grow a set and actually start to fully comprehend what is occurring in France and why the French are taking to the streets, and why in increasing number of instances the CRS, the riot police in France, are removing their helmets and basically letting it be known that they have no desire to beat up their kinsmen, because at the end of the day they are also going to be affected by this. So basically it's time to wake up. And there's a lot of very, very smart people in this country, and unfortunately what keeps them blinkered is their mistaken belief that if they ignore what's going on around them, and if they don't comment on something that they feel is politically incorrect, then they can effectively protect their bubble lifestyle, and that they can dismiss observations such as this as simply conspiracy theory. Yet unfortunately the reality is fast approaching. And the Belgians also, by the way, are balking at signing this accord, and I believe the Belgian government has actually now agreed to take a vote on Tuesday as to whether it should actually sign this accord. And Hungary is also considering maybe not signing it now that they have had the opportunity to digest the full implications. Here in Britain, no one even knows it's being signed, because that's the plan. Theresa May and her invisible international relations manager, who I believe is a guy by the name of Bert, or should that be Burke? So, he's going to sign in immigration as a human right, and criticism of the open border policy will be classified as hate speech. But you have to listen to this, my final comment. This is classic common purpose speak. Mr. Burt said the UK government is supportive of the UN's global compact for safe, orderly and regular migration, both as a step forward in international cooperation to tackle irregular migration and as a framework to help us deliver our commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals means sustaining the lifestyle of the global corporatists at the expense of everyone else. Well, you have a great weekend. I will be back on Monday morning, and if you are in the London area next week, then please do come along and join me at the Royal Courts in Fetter Lane on Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. Court will start each day at 10 o'clock, where I shall be challenging the corporatocracy's attempt to establish the raft of legislation sitting above parliamentary law, which gives them the opportunity to do whatever the hell they like. And this is just the thin end of a very, very fat wedge. So unless you want to see toxic, highly toxic nuclear waste buried in boreholes right across the north of England, because that's the ultimate agenda, then come along to the court in London next week. Meanwhile, see you on Monday. Take care.